Well, I think, I mean, first thing I would say is, that if Europe is solidly against Trump's position, undoubtedly that there are certain factions in Washington that are giving that a green light. I don't think, in my experience, these things don't happen out of the blue, that you have all of the European Union taking a stand on Trump's proposals for Ukraine, nor do you really have the Europeans almost to a person calling for war with Russia. No, those are two separate issues, perhaps, and we can deal with them sort of separately. But I think if you ask what happened and what was why, I mean, you can go far back to the 19th century and so on in Europe's relationship with Russia, but more recently, I think we really go to the Biden administration period. And it coincided with a time when the European Union really had what they called a democracy gap. It didn't, it wasn't democratic. It still isn't, but it was pretty obvious then that there was a democracy gap. But there was also an identity gap because, I mean, a technocracy doesn't give ordinary Europeans an identity. It's just, a thing that regulates. It's not something that you would go and sort of sacrifice for, the technocracy in Brussels. And then Biden started talking, if you recall, we had um, that image from Liberty Hall speech where it was all, bathed in dark red colors, and really it was quite sinister in its appearance, and deliberately made it sinister because then he produced a really very Manichaean speech, say, that the world was facing two evils. Autocracy was the main evil, but it was also that of Russia. And he dressed it up in very clear Manichaean language of dark and light, of good and evil. And then he repeated that in Warsaw in even more dramatic terms, talking about that this was a moment where you have to choose between good and evil and the light. And of course, America always stood for the light. It was the sitting on the hill as a beacon to the world, and Russia was this dark force that had to be resisted. Um, and there was a speech very shortly after by von der Leyen, and she almost parroted that speech. She said very much the same thing. This is light and dark and totally Manichaean terms. And I think what was happening in Europe was a number of things. That first of all, suddenly this provided Europe with its missing components. You know, Here was something that could give them values. There wasn't a European value. I mean, if you ask an ordinary European, and I was part of the European Union, that what does Europe stand for? You'd have got, well, it was only 12 states then, but you'd have got many different answers about it. And here was a something that you could gather Europe around, if you like, a sort of good and evil value of fighting against autocracy, against tyranny, and in favor of the light and of progress and of a vision. I think that was then seized on as a sort of identity for Europe. Just as Ukraine, which is sort of a complementary part of this, has become the pole around which they've tried to forge European unity together, to try and bring it together in this form. And at that time, I mean, the Europeans were really fawning on Washington for this language and this type of thinking. And NATO was being pulled into this. At the same time, you had the German foreign minister, then Baerbock, actually going to give speeches in New York at this time saying, you know, Germany has given up the idea of change through trade. It wants weapons. It wants military muscle. It wants to be a part of your project. In other words, it proposed, and she said, at one time in the past, Obama had said, well, Germany and Washington could form a joint, if you like, military structure together. And she said, of course, it didn't happen. But this was her aim, was that Germany would be not so much part of a European structure, but totally connected into the Biden war machine at that time. And this, I think, has developed in the European Union over time, has developed. And, Manichaeism does have a sort of strain of Messianism about it. And I think people have become really quite, the European leaders have become quite Messianic in this pursuit of, the light and fighting autocracy and the evil. And now they seem ready, and they talk about going to war with against Russia. And you have all these sort of bizarre statements coming out from the German defense minister and others saying, well, there will be war with Russia by 2028. No, it may even be next year. And then we've just had the Secretary General of NATO saying we have to prepare for a war that is going to be on a scale like our grandparents encountered, in other words, the First or Second World War. Well, this is bizarre. I mean, it makes no sense. And I think it is also highly dangerous. But this is what is happening, I think. And so we've had this, and this is why there were such screams of anxiety when this national strategic statement was produced by the United States, which suggested that NATO had an end date to it, and also took a very sharp swipe at Europe and its lack of values, and its lack of democracy, and its lack of legitimacy. And this was really a shock, and I think something that they, even though they knew there was tensions with the Trump administration, they didn't believe that they would be criticized quite in this way. So what we see, what is happening essentially, is that the NSS, the strategic statement, effectively undercuts the whole of that narrative of a Manichaean war of dark and light, because it said, no, a priority, American priority, is to restore stability with Russia, restore a stable relationship with Russia and a stable relation in Europe with Russia. Just the opposite of what they had tried to suggest and propose. And then it went further in the NSS, because this is the only glue that held the European Union together, Ukraine. And the NSS also said that we are working towards a solution on Ukraine. And so it cut everything away and left the European elites, not the people of Europe, but the European elites, I mean, completely bereft of the identity that they wanted to cling on to the legitimacy of the whole project. Everything was being cut away in this MSF. And so they returned and pursued it with a sort of demonic zeal, was trying to go to extraordinary illegal lengths to try and steal the Russians. They're no longer frozen now. Russian sovereign funds that are held in Europe, and the tussle with America over this. So I think this is really why they have become so demonic about it. But it defies, and I don't think you can try and analyze it in terms of, secular rationalism. It's not. We're moving into something really, that has no. There are, of course, deep feelings of. There are quite sour feelings in Europe of a desire for revenge for what has happened to parts of Europe as a consequence of former wars with Russia. And that can't be denied too. But beyond that, I mean, we've seen this taking this front. And it's the only glue that holds the whole project together.
I always made the point that I think the EU is a bit more vulnerable to this Manichaeanism as well, because it's a good way of having unity among 27 member states. If everything is an issue of good and evil, dark versus light, then it's easier to herd everyone in the same direction. I mean, once you introduce different shades of gray, it's easier to begin to fragment along competing interests. But
and if it goes, I mean, if the Ukraine project it collapses, implodes, I mean, what is it that holds the European Union together, the 27 states? I mean, because, the idea was, first of all, it was going to be also guided by net zero and the move towards eliminating all forms of carbon from the system. And that was going to provide what was necessary, a different way of percolating money through the system, flooding the money through the system, which would help the banks and everything. They were desperately looking for some sort of structure, and they still are, that will provide, money and also provide the means for the European Union to go on spending if it goes on spending. So now they've sort of decided that the way to restore their economy is by defense spending. Vast amounts of defense spending, they believe will improve the economy and stimulate growth in Europe. Well, of course, it doesn't. I mean, defense spending is notable. Yes, the shares of some of the defense companies will rise because there'll be profits made. But what happens? You produce tanks, and unless there's a war, they stay in a warehouse, and they don't add to the, if you like, the overall economic welfare of the community at all. The same with other elements of it. So, the real economy is not really impacted. I mean, there may be a slight increase in employment, but there is not a great deal of, I think, a desire for most Europeans to go and work in an armaments factory. I mean, they're culturally not really adjusted to that. And they're not culturally not looking for war. So I'm not sure that this is a project which will either stimulate real economic growth. I mean, in a real economy, in the sense that gets to the heart of what men and women in Europe are looking for, which is well-paid jobs, money that can pay for medical care, schools, housing, all of these things which are becoming further and further out of reach. Just building weapons is not going to really produce that sort of increase in ordinary people's well-being at all, rather than a reverse. Because what it's going to do is attract capital away from, if you like, small businesses that are manufacturing things in Italy or in Germany. It will attract capital away. Capital has been going in this period increasingly to financial assets, but it attracts capital away from the small, lower level companies, because the companies will be directed by the government to put their money into, the big armaments structures.